Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the fourth chapter in the book of Nehemiah. And one of the things I've been trying to do lately, and this is a practice I wish to recommend and encourage, is really trying to fit the chapter in the book to the wider narrative of the Bible. And what we witness in Nehemiah really begins with Moses, and the pattern which is manifest from him to him is that God always supplies the right type of leader at the right type of time for his people. Now, when the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, and the Pharaoh issued an order to kill the newborns. This little boy was cast afloat by the faith of a Hebrew mother and discovered by the Pharaoh's daughter, who raised him in royalty. And it wasn't until much later that Moses comes to an awareness of who he is, but he would have had the familiarity of the protocol, because Pharaoh, he would have grown up as his stepbrother. He would have known the way to approach him and speak on behalf of his people and tell them to let them go. And he was a humble man. And then Joshua became necessary, his type of leadership. Moses was a prophet and a lawgiver, and described as the meekest man there ever was in Numbers 12:3. But meekness is, Joshua was a different type of leader. His skill was in military, and so he was the one who led the troops into conquering the land that Yahweh had promised to Abraham. And then after him, the needs were really, once Israel moved from an exodus people, a people in captivity, to an independent nation, that's really the pattern. He raised up a series of judges when their apostasy-induced oppression came, and they cried out mightily to him. And then he rose up David to the throne as a model of righteous rule. And he is the model monarch of Israel, not only military might, but righteous rule. And he's described as a man after God's own heart in Acts 13:22 and implicitly in 1 Samuel 13:14. But his son Solomon was the combination of righteous ruler guided by wisdom. So his reign represented a golden age of sorts. And the differences between Solomon and David was that David was a warrior, Solomon was a peacemaker. His name Solomon is derived from the Hebrew word shalom, which describes a word which English doesn't adequately translate into, but that's neither here nor there. But and then after David and Solomon, the kings who came and went after them were of mixed character, and so the needs became different during the exile. And he supplied them with Daniel, a winning personality who attracted the sponsorship, the trust, and the endorsement of all the progression of empires. He served King Cyrus, the original Persian emperor, the same way he served Nebuchadnezzar, the king who had conquered him. In his position as their top dog, their number two, ensured the protection of the people throughout the exile. And then in Nehemiah's day, they're kind of getting back to where it all began. They're in the business of rebuilding a nation which was shattered and left in ruins, that they are assigned to by their Persians, who liberated them from the Babylonians, who sort of conquered them. And the most pressing need at this moment in time is the restoration of a wall, because all ancient cities, there's a reason that no ancient city ever existed without a wall, is because it would have been reduced to smithereens. This was militarily necessary in the ancient world to protect a city and the people in it. So Jerusalem without a wall is not going to be a city where the temple can be built and flourish, because that's the ultimate reason that they are there. And I just want to connect this to Scripture, to more recent history. America is not, strictly speaking, a covenant nation, but I believe we are we do have a divine mission and destiny, and God has provided for us for our leadership needs similarly. So when our experimental infant republic was experimenting with this bold new idea of freely elected leaders, the most real threat and the most potentially ruinous one was the delicate unity being fractured. So God called up a man, George Washington, who didn't even want the job, but he was the only one who had the universal esteem, acclaim, and respect to win the ballot unanimously. Then when he rose up Thomas Jefferson to move our country in a more truly equal generation. I know Thomas Jefferson has been on the receiving end of being a bum rap for being a slaveholder, but in truth he did, in spite of holding slaves, he did more intellectually and in activity to advance the liberty of man than any other human who ever really existed. And then Abraham Lincoln became necessary when the delicate unity of these these former colonies who had decided at their founding to become a united state. So they were going to function not as 13 autonomous units, but to have a central authority in Washington, D.C., and the election of a man who had lost in just about everything he had done in life until the election, which mattered most. Abraham Lincoln proved to be our greatest president by conquering, and he was a deep man of faith, by conquering and prevailing in the war for our unity, which incidentally abolished slavery, which was a blight on liberty that really needed to be gotten done away with. But the problem was there was no immediate solution. Thomas Jefferson was actually abolitionist by sentiment, but the realities of his life, long story short, he was a free spending spirit, and he acquired a lavish lifestyle which necessitated his maintenance on slave labor. But then in the 20th century, he sent us Teddy Roosevelt. His youthful energy and activity were necessary to chart our nation and to navigate the international waters. We were no longer, strictly speaking, specific to Atlantic nation anymore, but we are isolationist for all intents and results would be henceforth obsolete. And then when Depression struck, the Great Depression, financial calamity, he sent us Franklin Roosevelt, who, even though he didn't do much statistically to alleviate the Depression, he had a winning spirit. He was described by Lyndon Johnson as the one person who was never afraid, and that was his greatest quality. He inspired courage in a moment that required national unity above all else, and since we came on top on World War, he was not only the president during the Depression, but also World War II, which he did not live to see its victorious conclusion. But even though America resulted from that conflict in a position of unique superiority, we had the only atomic weapon, which we've dropped, the only two that have been dropped so far. But then sort of these other people get them, and we have to fight to maintain our number one position. And there are moments of what the prophets of doom of their time thought were moments of irreversible decline. America was retreating financially and militarily, but then Ronald Reagan came and proved the soothsayers of dooms wrong, and he restored our rightful place under the sun as the world's only superpower. And he was a deep man of faith, a deep revivalist, and it really saddens and sickens me to see this nation, which I'm privileged to live in, being torn apart. A nation that was founded on faith and has flourished under the same. The pilgrims who planted this country had a vision for a beacon on a hill, of which we read of in Matthew's 5th chapter. And all the founding fathers were men of tremendous faith, and Abe Lincoln was a man of faith. Ronald, all these. So even as our detachment from our values have eroded, and we have invited national calamity and catastrophe, even in the midst of our prosperity, there is always a righteous remnant, which convinces me that has protected America thus far from the exile that the Israelites responded. And this brings us to Donald Trump, who I believe elected or rose Donald Trump up for the same reason he rose up Nehemiah. Now, as we earlier mentioned, the walls were strategically necessary, and no city or nation could do without them in the ancient world. But then as the Middle Ages turned into the modern world, the nature of warfare changed so that castles were no longer strategically necessary. Everything was out in the open, and the necessity of walls became somewhat obsolete. But in the times in which we live, their needs are more than ever. They are present. They are everywhere they're planted. The history, science, and experience tells us that walls work, and there is people who refuse to believe, and the reason they do not believe is because they do not want to believe. So Nehemiah, like Trump, was, God's anointed and a man of faith. I realize Donald Trump has a checkered history, but it's never, the first is last and the last is first. I'm fully convinced he's become a born-again Christian before or aspiring to the office. I believe he has a sense of mission and destiny of God, in that he elected and appointed him to the task. Now, Nehemiah faced a demoralized nation in need of a wall. So the same thing that Donald Trump is doing right now as we speak. We are more demoralized than ever. We witness what we gained during Reagan's years kind of slither away to other people. We wasted a nation-building exercise. The war on terror was just, we carried it. It was necessary in itself, but we carried it to a ruinous extreme by pushing it beyond its necessary or natural boundaries. And also the financial collapse of 2008 and the perpetual poverty, which has somewhat been reversed of late, and this where others see an obstacle and an impossibility, Nehemiah and Trump are like-minded in the same vision. They see an opportunity. There's all these people saying that we can't build a wall across the Rio Grande, but we can and we will, and we have a stake in it, and we have a role to play, because it is God's will that we do have a wall, because that's just the way it is. And but Nehemiah and Trump were more than just mere builders. Now, Trump is a builder by background, which is the unique qualifications, and there's all these biographical backgrounds, some of which we didn't even scratch the surface of the leaders of Israel and America thus far. And but Donald Trump is a builder by background, like Nehemiah, who had to build a wall. So they were called for the right moment in the right time, and they both faced tremendous opposition to obstructionists. Now, the conspiracy aligned against Nehemiah was one of natives from the north, the south, the east, and the west, who were threatened by the restoration of Jerusalem's wall, because they were militarily threatened by a city they could no longer walk over because there was no wall over it. So there was a conspiracy of them who used. Now, he gained the permission of the Persian king to go there in the first place. He left a comfortable life in the palace of the Persian emperor, where he had intimate access to him as his cupbearer, to go to the difficulties of building a city in ruins, much like Donald Trump who gave up a fabulous billionaire lifestyle to rescue a nation in its greatest hour of need. That is something he's always had the presidential bug in him, but he's always made it clear that he would not want to do it unless it became so necessary, and that's the place we kind of find ourselves in right now. And but they were both unafraid. Nehemiah didn't waste a split second listening to the verbal antagonisms of the two principal antagonists to this plan we read in the 4th chapter, which we're actually going to save for another lesson because we went on a tangent that's going to make it impossible to cover the whole of this chapter. But to return to the point I was making earlier, which I don't quite remember what it was, but I guess we can wrap this lesson up right now. History does repeat itself to the discerning viewer of eyes. We have a divine destiny. I'll always consider myself a Christian first and a patriot second, and patriotism can be an idol, as we witness in Jonah, for example. But in America, we are a Christian nation. We have a divine, no matter how post-Christian we become, there's always going to be a righteous remnant among us to keep this nation going. And it's going to get a lot more difficult before it gets better. But we're blessed at this glorious moment in time to be living in what could be a golden age of America. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. I try to avoid speculations in my exegesis in general. But the one thing we are witnessing under this president is our restoration. We're rebuilding native infrastructure. We're not outsourcing jobs anymore. We're keeping everything America. We're getting rid of the trade deals, which are disadvantageous to our interest. And winning the world over, not by military might, but by peace and prosperity. So I believe it every Christian's duty to support this man. And even if you can't bring yourself to support this man for whatever reason, and I'm sure there's 1,000,001 amongst Christians, not all Christians are conservatives, not all conservatives are Christians, although the best the best conservatives do make Christians. Conservatives don't necessarily make the best Christians, but you're still duty bound to pray for him, whether you like it or not. I did the same. I generally tend to, this is the fullest confession of my political ideas, which I'm more accustomed to expressing in writing than, but that's, I do believe all issues are interconnected, and our country can only flourish in as much as it remains faithful. Now we have this monumental task ahead of us, but we can endure with the endurance of these men. What can we learn from Nehemiah is ultimately something I want to cover in another, perhaps I'll do one of this chapter, but I think I've said enough about the connections between Trump and Nehemiah, which I'm going to relabel to the title of this discourse from that which I originally planned. But that's just the way it unfolds sometimes. I never follow a script. These things have a life of our own. I normally am more disciplined in keeping my tangents, but I like the way this one ended up flowing, so I'm going to keep it and stick around. You never know. You might be surprised. I just was. So stay tuned until next time. Bye-bye. Thanks.